The warning did not sound dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed fists, no panic in his voice. It was said quietly over a map table, almost casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. 3 weeks later, entire units were gone, roads were choked with wreckage, and the silence that followed was louder than artillery. When a legend warns you about another legend, and you laugh, what do you say when the ground collapses under your boots? My name is Daniel Mercer, an American intelligence officer attached to liaison duties in the summer of 1944. My job was simple on paper: observe, translate, listen, and write everything down. In reality, it meant standing close enough to the enemy to hear what they said when they believed the war was still bending their way. That was how I ended up inside a stone farmhouse outside Cannes, listening to a man the Germans called the Desert Fox. His real name was Erwin Rommel, and even in a losing war, his presence bent the room toward him. The farmhouse smelled of damp wood and cigarette smoke soaked into old stone. Maps covered the table, their edges curled, lines redrawn so many times they looked nervous. Rommel stood at the head, calm, composed hands, resting lightly on the paper as if steadying it. His generals leaned in with confidence that came from surviving the landings. They believed the worst had passed. They believed the Allies would push, slowly grind forward, and bleed for every mile. Rommel let them speak first. He listened as they talked about beaches, reserves, and how the Americans would exhaust themselves against prepared lines. When they finished, he tapped the map once, then again, drawing their attention away from the obvious fronts. He spoke about speed, not tanks, but decisions. He spoke about timing, not numbers. And then he said, the name that changed the temperature of the room: George S. Patton. He did not insult Patton. He did not praise him either. He described him like a problem that refused to stay solved. He said Patton would not attack where they expected. He said Patton would move faster than their reports, faster than their permission, and faster than their pride. He said waiting to confirm Patton's location would be the mistake that cost them time they could not replace. Some of the generals smiled. One joked that Patton was still in England, commanding fake armies and chasing ghosts. Another said Americans were loud, predictable, reckless once they met real resistance. Rommel listened, nodded once, and said something I wrote down immediately. He said Patton was most dangerous when you could not see him. He said invisibility was not absence, it was preparation. The meeting ended without argument, without raised voices. Rommel walked out, leaving his warning behind like an unexploded shell. No one picked it up. The first week after that meeting felt almost peaceful. Reports came in routine, manageable. German units adjusted positions, confident they were shaping the battlefield. I listened to intercepted messages, nothing alarming enough to break the narrative. Patton remained unseen, and that absence became proof that Rommel was overthinking. Then the small inconsistencies began. A supply depot lost overnight, a road cut that should have been secure, a unit reporting contact where intelligence said there should be none. Each incident was explained away. Local action resistance fighters, fog of war. Rommel asked questions. The answers came late, softened, reassuring. If you are still listening, ask yourself this: when evidence challenges your confidence, do you investigate the evidence or protect the confidence? The German command protected the confidence. By the second week, the pattern sharpened. Allied pressure no longer felt like a single push. It felt like probing fingers testing seams. German responses lagged just enough to feel wrong. Rommel pressed harder in meetings. He repeated his warning with different words. He said Patton hated waiting. He said Patton understood momentum as a weapon. He said speed was not about engines, it was about acting before the enemy agreed on reality. A general folded his arms and said they had intelligence on Patton's tendencies. Rommel replied that tendencies were what Patton used against you. He said Patton wanted to be predicted because prediction narrowed your thinking. The general laughed. Rommel did not. The third week began with rain and ended with smoke. Reports flooded in too fast to organize cleanly. Units were being outflanked before realizing they were threatened. Roads filled with retreating vehicles collided with advancing armor that should not have arrived yet. Orders crossed paths, arrived late, contradicted each other. Patton was not breaking through the front, he was sliding through gaps no one wanted to admit existed. I remember standing behind Rommel as he studied a fresh map covered in red marks. He was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was flat, almost tired. He said the chance to stop Patton had already passed. He said, now the only question was how much ground would be lost before anyone admitted it. That afternoon, someone finally asked Rommel how he could be so certain about Patton. Rommel answered without hesitation. He said Patton was a gambler who trusted instinct more than permission. He said Patton believed confusion created opportunity, He said Patton would accept chaos if it meant movement, because movement decided wars faster than control. The room went quiet. No one liked hearing that the enemy was winning because he was willing to break rules they still respected. By the end of the third week, laughter was gone. Confidence cracked into argument. Units were shifted too often, chasing threats that refused to stay still. Rommel pushed for flexibility for pulling back in some sectors to stabilize others. He was overruled. The belief that control could be restored was stronger than the evidence that it was already gone. That night, I wrote something in my notebook that never appeared in any report. I wrote that wars are not lost when armies run out of men or machines. They are lost when leaders ignore the warning that does not fit their pride. I did not yet understand how quickly that pride would be punished, because the next move Patton made did not just bend the German line. It shattered the illusion that they still controlled the tempo of the war. And once that illusion broke, it took more with it than anyone in that farmhouse was prepared to lose. As I closed my notebook and listened to distant gunfire rolling across the fields, one thought stayed with me. Rommel had not been warning his generals about Patton. He had been warning them about themselves. And by the time they understood that Patton was already moving again faster than their fear could follow. The fourth week began with movement that did not show up on any official map. I noticed it first in the gaps between reports, the hours where nothing arrived, then suddenly everything arrived at once. That rhythm was wrong. Armies do not go quiet before they slow down. They go quiet before they sprint. Rommel knew this, and I knew he knew it because he stopped asking for confirmation and started asking who had already moved without permission. Inside headquarters, tension shifted from confidence to irritation. Generals snapped at aides, blamed poor communications, blamed weather, blamed junior officers for failing to deliver clarity. What they did not blame was the assumption that Patton would wait his turn. That assumption had hardened into doctrine, and doctrine is heavy, it does not turn easily. Every delay in decision felt small on its own, but together they formed a pattern Patton could feel from miles away. I spent that week buried in intercepted traffic, translating fragments that did not want to fit together. Units reported American armor appearing and disappearing like it was testing the ground. Bridges were taken, not held, then abandoned. Villages changed hands without anyone claiming them. The reports were frustrating because they sounded indecisive. In truth, they were precise. Patton was drawing lines with motion, not ink. Rommel pressed again in a briefing that felt more strained than the last. He pointed to a corridor the Germans considered low priority, a stretch of road thought too narrow, too exposed, too inconvenient for a serious thrust. He said Patton would use it. He said Patton preferred roads that made his enemy uncomfortable because discomfort slowed thinking. One general argued that the terrain favored defense. Rommel replied that defense only worked when the defender believed in it. The argument ended without resolution. Orders went out half-formed. Units were told to prepare for multiple possibilities, which meant preparing for none. Patton exploited that hesitation immediately. By midweek, German columns were on the move, not because they chose to be, but because they were being forced to respond. Each response came a step late. Each step late widened the gap. If you are still listening, this is the moment to ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many mistakes does it take to become strategy? The German command was finding out in real time. The atmosphere inside headquarters grew heavy. Maps were updated constantly, but they lagged reality by hours. I watched officers redraw lines, only to erase them minutes later. Rommel stood apart, watching the process, with a look that was not anger, but something closer to resignation. He knew the tempo was gone. He knew Patton now owned it. By the end of that week, the evidence was undeniable. American forces under Patton were no longer probing. They were flowing. Supply lines stretched, but did not break. Units advanced on instinct, trusting momentum more than orders. German countermoves collided with each other, clogging roads, wasting fuel, exhausting men. What should have been organized resistance became improvisation under pressure. Rommel requested authority to pull back certain units to re-establish a coherent line. The request was denied. Higher command feared that withdrawal would look like weakness. They believed holding ground mattered more than holding coherence. Patton believed the opposite. He understood that once coherence broke, ground followed. I remember a moment late one evening when Rommel studied a report and shook his head slowly. He said Patton was not winning because he had more tanks. He was winning because he forced his enemy to argue with themselves. He said, the moment an army stops agreeing on what is happening, it stops being an army and becomes a collection of frightened men with weapons. The pressure continued to build. Reports of American columns advancing far beyond expected positions arrived with increasing frequency. German units began reporting fuel shortages, not from lack of supply, but from constant repositioning. Every move to block Patton opened another gap somewhere else. It was like trying to plug holes in water with bare hands. Late in the week, something happened that shifted the tone completely. A German armored unit redeployed twice in one day, based on conflicting orders, ran directly into an American spearhead it had not known existed. The engagement was brief and devastating. The unit was shattered. Survivors reported speed confusion and relentless forward motion. No pause, no consolidation, just movement. That report landed on the table like a verdict. The room fell silent. Rommel did not say anything. He did not need to. The warning he had given 3 weeks earlier was now written in wreckage and smoke across the countryside. As night fell, I walked outside headquarters and listened to distant engines echo across the dark. They were not retreating sounds. They were advancing ones. Patton was not slowing. He was accelerating. I returned to my desk and opened my notebook, writing faster than usual. I realized something then that chilled me more than the night air. The German command still believed this situation could be stabilized. They still believed Patton could be contained with one decisive move. They were already too late, and the decision they would make next, the one meant to stop Patton once and for all, would not just fail. It would open the door to something far worse. The decision came disguised as confidence. On paper, it looked decisive, even elegant. A counter-concentration of armor pulled from multiple sectors, assembled quickly, ordered to strike where Patton was expected to overextend. The generals called it a trap. Rommel did not. He stared at the plan for a long time, tracing the movement arrows with his finger, then finally said the quiet part out loud. He said this assumed Patton would wait long enough to be caught. No one answered him. They did not argue either. Silence settled in the room, heavy and stubborn. The order was already drafted. The belief behind it was simple. Patton was moving fast, therefore he must be reckless. If he was reckless, he would outrun his supply. If he outran his supply, he could be punished. It was a clean theory. It was also built on a misunderstanding. I spent that day translating intercepted chatter that did not match the theory. American units talked less about objectives and more about timing. They coordinated movement like runners, pacing each other, adjusting speed instinctively. Supply units followed closer than expected, not neatly but persistently. Patton was not outrunning his logistics. He was dragging them forward by refusing to slow down. Rommel tried one last time. In a smaller briefing, away from the noise of senior command, he warned that the counter-concentration would arrive late. He said Patton would sense it, forming and flow around it. He said mass only mattered if it arrived where it was meant to fight. Otherwise, it became a traffic jam. The officers listening nodded politely. None of them changed the plan. If you are still listening, this is where stories usually talk about fate. This was not fate. This was choice, layered on top of choice. The counter-move began at dawn. German armor rolled into position engines, growling crews tense but confident. Reports initially sounded promising. Contact was light. American resistance seemed thin. The generals relaxed. They believed Patton had finally miscalculated. Then the reports changed tone. American units disengaged instead of holding. They fell back just far enough to invite pursuit. German armor pushed forward, eager to close the gap. Roads clogged, columns stretched, communication lagged. By the time commanders realized they were advancing into uncertainty, Patton had already shifted again. What followed was not a single battle, but a series of collisions. German units encountered American forces in places that made no sense according to the plan. Flanks exposed themselves without realizing it. Attempts to regroup ran into fresh American formations, arriving from unexpected directions. Patton was not avoiding the counter-move. He was slicing it into pieces. I watched Rommel receive the reports one by one. He did not curse. He did not slam the table. He simply nodded as each confirmation arrived, as if ticking off predictions he had already made. He said Patton was doing exactly what he always did. He said Patton was letting the enemy commit fully before revealing the real direction of movement. By midday, the counter-concentration had lost coherence. Units fought bravely, but bravery did not fix broken timing. Fuel ran low from constant maneuver. Orders contradicted each other, as commanders tried to react to a battlefield that refused to stay still. What was meant to be a trap became a series of isolated fights, each one bleeding strength without gaining control. The generals argued. Some blamed intelligence. Some blamed execution. One blamed Rommel for not supporting the plan more enthusiastically. Rommel said nothing. He walked outside and stood alone for several minutes, watching clouds drift low over the fields. When he returned, he said the words no one wanted to hear. He said the initiative was gone. That night, the scale of the damage became clear. Maps showed American advances deeper than anyone had predicted. Entire defensive concepts were rendered irrelevant in days. Patton had not just bypassed strong points. He had made them meaningless by removing the reason they existed. Supply hubs sat intact but useless, disconnected from a front that no longer passed through them. I wrote until my hand cramped. For the first time, my notes felt less like observation and more like witness. This was not a gradual shift. This was a break. The German command was reacting to a war that had already moved on. Rommel met briefly with a few trusted officers. "I was close enough to hear fragments," he said. Patton understood something many generals forgot. He said war was not about holding positions, it was about forcing decisions. He said Patton forced decisions faster than his enemy could process them. That speed was now irreversible. Near midnight, a final report arrived that drained what little optimism remained. An American column had crossed a line the Germans believed impossible to reach so quickly. It was not a decisive objective on its own, but it opened a door, and once doors open in war, they rarely close cleanly. The room went quiet again. No one spoke. Everyone understood that the plan meant to stop Patton had instead revealed how vulnerable they had become. As I closed my notebook, one thought settled in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Rommel had warned them about Patton. They had ignored him. Now Patton was no longer the problem. The problem was what came next. The collapse did not announce itself with panic, it arrived as paperwork. Orders stacked up faster than they could be read. Amendments crossed each other. Couriers arrived, breathless with messages already outdated. The headquarters felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the building itself sensed it no longer mattered where it stood on the map. Rommel moved through this with a quiet urgency, not rushing, not hesitating, making notes that no one else wanted to make. He called it a crisis of alignment. He said the army still had men and machines, but it had lost agreement. Units no longer shared the same picture of the war. Some believed they were defending a line that no longer existed. Others believed they were attacking an enemy who had already moved. Patton thrived in that confusion. He did not need to destroy everything he needed to ensure nothing worked together. I spent hours translating fragments of radio traffic that sounded like arguments. Field commanders asked for clarity and received encouragement instead. They asked for permission and received silence. They asked for fuel and received instructions to move again. Each message added weight to the same truth. The system was straining under its own assumptions. Rommel requested authority to reorganize command boundaries. He argued that sectors drawn for a slower war were now liabilities. He wanted shorter lines, clearer responsibility, freedom to abandon ground that could not be held. The request traveled upward and returned thin and brittle. Hold positions, maintain morale, do not concede territory. The words were familiar. They were also fatal. Patton answered those words with motion. American columns appeared where they should not have been able to reach. They crossed roads thought too narrow, fields thought impassable, towns considered irrelevant. German defenses bristled in the wrong places, facing threats that never arrived. When contact did occur, it was brief and disorienting. Patton did not linger. He pressed through, leaving confusion behind him like exhaust. Rommel watched the reports accumulate and said the same thing more than once. He said Patton was not seeking battles, he was seeking consequences. Every move forced a response. Every response pulled something else loose. The German command tried to counter by issuing broader directives, which only widened the gap between order and reality. By midweek, something subtle but dangerous took hold. Fear of being wrong replaced fear of being late. Commanders delayed decisions to avoid blame. They asked for more confirmation, more reconnaissance, more certainty. Patton fed on that hesitation. His units moved on imperfect information, trusting initiative and speed. They accepted risk. The Germans tried to eliminate risk, and in doing so, surrendered time. If you are still listening, this is where you notice the difference between caution and paralysis. One saves lives, the other spends them slowly. Rommel convened a smaller council, fewer uniforms, fewer egos. He spoke plainly. He said the enemy had seized the initiative and would not give it back. He said the only chance left was to shorten the war in their minds, to stop thinking in weeks and start thinking in hours. He asked for authority to execute a controlled withdrawal to preserve cohesion. The request died in the room. No one wanted to be responsible for admitting defeat while maps still showed options. That afternoon, a report arrived that broke the last illusion. An American force had cut a critical junction not through brute force but through timing. German units, sent to defend it, arrived separately, piecemeal, each too late to help the other. The junction fell without a dramatic fight. Its loss did more damage than a battlefield defeat. It unraveled supply schedules, command routes, and confidence all at once. Rommel read the report twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. He said nothing. Later, alone with a few aides, he said, the war had entered a phase where traditional measures no longer applied. He said Patton had turned movement into a weapon, and that the weapon was now deep inside their system. Night fell heavy and close. I stepped outside and listened to the distant rumble of engines, closer than before, constant like a heartbeat that refused to slow. Inside, officers argued quietly, voices tight, eyes tired. Plans were drafted and redrafted, each one more complex than the last. Complexity felt like control. It was not. Rommel passed me in the corridor and stopped for a moment. He said, almost to himself, that Patton had done what every great commander tried to do. He had made the enemy fight the war he wanted, not the war they prepared for. Then Rommel walked on, leaving me with the uneasy sense that something final was approaching. Because the next response from higher command would not be another adjustment. It would be a gamble meant to restore authority in one stroke. And when that gamble was played, there would be no room left to maneuver. The gamble arrived, wrapped in authority and urgency, stamped and countersigned, delivered with the confidence of men who believed one decisive stroke could restore order. The directive called for a coordinated counterattack along a broad arc, a show of strength meant to shock Patton into slowing down. It demanded precision timing from units that had not shared a clear picture in days. Rommel read it once, then again, his expression unreadable. He said the plan assumed time still belonged to them. Execution began before doubt could settle. Columns rolled at first light, dust rising, engines strained. On paper, it looked impressive. In motion, it looked fragile. I listened to the radios fill with optimistic calls, then cautious updates, then short requests for clarification. Patton did not wait to see how the move would mature. He cut into it at the joints, not the center, hitting seams where coordination mattered most. The first twist came quickly. A German armored group meant to anchor the northern hinge encountered no enemy at all. They advanced into empty ground, convinced they were drawing Patton toward them. In reality, they were being pulled away from where they were needed. By the time the truth reached headquarters, American columns had slipped behind the southern hinge, cutting routes and forcing units to turn back into their own traffic. Rommel moved through the room with controlled intensity, redirecting messengers, simplifying instructions where he could. He warned that the gamble had become a liability, that it needed to be broken off before it broke them. The response from above was firm. Continue. Show resolve. Do not yield ground. The words felt heavier than the situation could carry. If you are still listening, this is where confidence becomes commitment and commitment becomes trap. Tap your approval if you feel the tension rising, because this is where the cost starts to show. By midday, the battlefield fragmented. German units fought well where they met Americans, but those meetings were isolated. Support arrived late or not at all. Fuel trucks were rerouted 3 times in an hour. Artillery plans dissolved as targets vanished. Patton did not contest ground he did not need. He let the Germans commit to places he had already decided to bypass. The outside twist landed in the afternoon, quiet and devastating. Reports arrived that French resistance had sabotaged a rail line far behind the front, not by blowing bridges, but by disrupting schedules. Trains arrived late, cargo misrouted commanders, waiting on supplies that were technically present, but practically unreachable. Patton had not ordered it. He did not need to. Momentum invited allies. Rommel acknowledged the reports with a nod. He said the war had crossed a threshold where control no longer flowed from headquarters outward. It flowed from movement inward. He asked again for permission to disengage parts of the gamble to preserve coherence. The answer came back delayed and conditional, effectively, no. As evening approached, the gamble collapsed into a series of local emergencies. Units requested permission to withdraw and received encouragement to hold. Holding meant burning fuel, burning men, burning time. Patton answered with a surge that felt effortless by comparison. American columns advanced on multiple axes, not deep thrusts, but steady pressure that forced German units to choose between fighting and escaping. I watched Rommel read a field report describing a German battalion that had marched all day to counter an American column, only to find it gone, replaced by another unit moving in a different direction. He said Patton was not winning battles, he was stealing options. Once options disappeared, outcomes followed. Night brought a lull that felt like a held breath. Headquarters glowed with lamps, officers hunched over maps that no longer matched the roads outside. Arguments softened into fatigue. Someone suggested pulling reserves from a quiet sector. Rommel replied that quiet sectors were illusions now. Quiet meant Patton had already passed through. Late that night, a messenger arrived with news that cut through the exhaustion. An American force had reached a river crossing thought safe for days. They had not taken it yet, they had simply arrived. That arrival forced 3 German units to reconsider their positions at once. The map changed without a shot fired. Rommel closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with resolve. He said the gamble had failed, and that continuing it would only deepen the loss. He began drafting instructions to shorten lines on his own authority, knowing the consequences. I realized then that the next hours would not be about stopping Patton. They would be about choosing what could still be saved. As the radios crackled and engines rumbled in the distance, one truth settled in my mind. The warning Rommel had given weeks earlier was no longer a warning, it was a verdict, and the attempt to defy it had only made the sentence harsher. The 6th week did not feel like a continuation of the last one, it felt like a different war. The sound of movement never stopped now. Engines ran through the night, radios crackled without pause, and maps aged by the hour. Rommel acted on instinct rather than permission, issuing shorter orders, drawing lines meant to hold people together rather than hold ground. He said cohesion was the last resource left, and it was running thin. Higher command reacted badly. Messages arrived, questioning authority, demanding explanations, insisting that discipline be restored. Rommel read them and set them aside. He focused on what was in front of him, units fraying at the edges, commanders' exhausted roads, clogged with men trying to move faster than their orders. Patton pressed again, not with a single blow, but with relentless presence. Wherever German units tried to pause, Americans appeared, forcing another decision, another move. I watched the reports change in tone. Words like probing and contact disappeared, replaced by pressure and displacement. American units did not stop to celebrate gains. They flowed through, leaving German forces scrambling to reorient. Every attempt to form a stable line was undone by a movement that arrived before it could settle. Patton was not rushing blindly. He was pacing the enemy, always a step ahead. If you are still listening, this is where the story tightens. This is where the tension stops rising gradually and begins to spike. The decisive moment came in the early hours of a gray morning. A German corps commander, acting on outdated information, committed his reserves to block what he believed was the main American thrust. The reserves moved hard and fast, burning fuel, ignoring caution. They arrived to find the threat already gone. In their place came another American column, hitting from a direction no one had anticipated. The reserves were caught turning exposed and shattered in hours. That loss broke something fundamental. The German command network staggered. Orders went out and came back unanswered. Units began making independent decisions, some retreating, some holding, some advancing into nothing. Rommel called it the moment when command became suggestion. He said once that happened, the war entered free fall. Patton sensed it. American pressure intensified, not recklessly but confidently. Bridges were seized intact because German units withdrew too late to destroy them. Supply dumps fell, not because they were defended poorly, but because no one could agree who was responsible for them anymore. Patton exploited the smallest hesitation, turning minutes into miles. Rommel gathered what authority he still had and made his final operational choice. He ordered a broad withdrawal to preserve what cohesion remained, ignoring instructions that insisted on holding symbolic ground. It was the only rational move left, and it came with risk. He knew it would be interpreted as defeat. He also knew the alternative was annihilation. The withdrawal began unevenly. Some units executed cleanly, falling back in good order. Others hesitated, waiting for confirmation that never came. Patton did not chase recklessly. He cut routes, forced detours, turned withdrawals into races. German columns moved under constant pressure, never quite breaking, never quite stabilizing. The climax arrived in the afternoon, sharp and unmistakable. An American armored group broke through a narrowing gap and severed a critical command artery. Messages stopped flowing. Coordination collapsed. German units found themselves isolated, fighting local battles without awareness of the larger picture. Patton had achieved what Rommel had feared from the beginning. He had taken the tempo and made it irreversible. I stood beside Rommel as the final reports arrived, incomplete and grim. He did not react outwardly. He simply acknowledged each one, his expression calm in a way that felt heavier than anger. He said Patton had done exactly what great commanders did. He had turned speed into certainty and confusion into leverage. As evening fell, American forces surged again, exploiting openings faster than German units could close them. The sound of engines rolled closer, constant and confident. The war here was decided, even if it would take time for everyone to accept it. Rommel turned to a small group of officers and said the words that marked the true end. He said, "The initiative was gone for good." He said what remained was damage control, not victory. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue about. As I wrote that night, exhaustion pulling at my hands, one thought cut through the fog. Rommel had warned them about Patton because he recognized himself in the enemy. He understood what happened when momentum met hesitation, and now, the final consequences of ignoring that warning were no longer theoretical. They were arriving on steel tracks and dusty roads, closing in from every direction. The last phase did not end with a dramatic collapse. It ended with acceptance. The sound of the front faded into distance, not because the fighting stopped, but because it moved beyond our ability to influence it. Headquarters packed up quietly. Maps were rolled with care they no longer deserved. Couriers were reassigned to escort duties. The war here had slipped past us, leaving behind paperwork and consequences. Rommel spent his final days in that sector, focused on preservation. He ordered roads cleared not for advance, but for escape. He prioritized wounded and exhausted units over symbolic positions. Some called it defeatism. Others understood it as responsibility. He said more than once that leadership was measured by what you saved when victory was no longer possible. I watched German units withdraw under pressure that never fully lifted. American forces stayed close, not pressing recklessly, always present enough to deny rest. Patton did not chase headlines. He chased outcomes. The withdrawals became thinner, less organized, but they did not collapse entirely. Rommel had managed to slow the bleeding, though the wound itself was fatal. In quiet moments, officers spoke differently. The jokes were gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was analysis, honest and sharp. Many admitted too late that they had misunderstood Patton. They had seen speed and assumed recklessness. They had seen confidence and assumed predictability. Rommel had seen something else from the beginning. He had seen intent. If you are still listening, this is where the lesson finally lands. The warning was never about Patton alone. It was about what happens when you mistake comfort for control. I accompanied Rommel during one of his last inspections. He moved slowly, speaking with junior officers, listening more than he talked. When one asked him how he knew Patton would be this dangerous, Rommel answered without hesitation. He said Patton acted as if time was his primary weapon. He said anyone who understood that would either learn to match it or be destroyed by it. Soon after, Rommel was recalled. The official reasons were phrased carefully. Everyone understood the truth. His warnings had been correct, but correctness did not outweigh politics. The war moved on without him, just as it had moved on without the plans he tried to defend. I returned to my own lines weeks later, carrying notebooks filled with observations that would never become official doctrine. Patton continued to advance, not without setbacks, not without cost, but with momentum no one could deny. German resistance stiffened in places, but it never regained coherence. The tempo was set. The ending, while still distant, no longer felt uncertain. Years later, when people asked me about that summer, they expected stories of tanks and explosions. I told them about a warning spoken calmly in a farmhouse, and about how it was ignored because it challenged confidence. I told them wars often turn not on the loudest decisions, but on the quiet ones no one wants to hear. The irony stayed with me. Rommel was famous for speed, for daring, for audacity. He recognized those traits immediately in Patton. He tried to translate experience into caution. His generals heard weakness instead. They learned too late that speed does not forgive hesitation. When I think back now, the image that returns is simple. A map table, a finger tapping not the obvious front but the empty space beside it. A warning delivered without drama, and an army that chose comfort over change. By the time the ground gave way beneath them, Patton was already moving again somewhere ahead, forcing the next decision before the last one could be understood. And that, more than any battle, was why the warning mattered.